Our God is on his throne ruling the affairs of men. God does not change. His truths have not changed. He's promised a witness in the church according to the election of grace in all ages that will stand for the old paths, defending his truth. The Primitive Baptist Digital Library is pleased to present the Word of Sovereign Grace. Timely video messages based on the King James Bible and the doctrines taught by Christ and the apostles.
Opportunity to meet together in the house of God. We appreciate the things Brother Lyle said. We appreciate his humble fervent prayer. I'm certainly in agreement with what he had to say a while ago about contending and standing for the truth, despite the fact that there are many who will not cry out, and despite the fact that there are many that will deliberately avoid controversial subjects. But it's always been my policy to preach whatever is on my mind, and I have to ask the Lord to guide and direct it. And sometimes when you preach several times to people, preach a week or so to the same people, naturally, because the needs of people vary, there will be certain subjects that you will enjoy more than others, and many times the thing that we enjoy the most might not be what we need the most. I remember many times when I was growing up, that sometimes my mother would feed me things that I enjoyed, but I learned later from studying diet, nutrition, and medicine that those were not really the things I needed. And some of the things that I was required to eat, I found out later, were very good for me. So it's always been my desire, in trying to preach several times to the same people, the Lord would allow us to preach on a variety of subjects, but I'm not aware of the individual needs of people here today. Perhaps there are folks here that have doctrinal questions that your children and people that you know have asked you, and perhaps you might feel like you need more of a doctrinal message. There may be others here that's lost your loved ones, or you're in great trials. You might need some of the comfort of the Scriptures. And all I can do is depend on the Lord to lead my mind, and I hope that you'll pray for me. And if it's not what you feel like you particularly need, maybe you don't know what you need, but at least bear with us. We appreciate the opportunity again to gather here. I've told you before, I'll tell you one more time, that I only preach what's on my mind, because I know of nothing more ridiculous than for a man to be talking about one thing and his mind be somewhere else. But if I follow the impressions of my mind, I've been thinking this morning of some advice that was given to me when I was a teenage boy by a man who was one of my fathers in ministry and was pastor of my home church for 27 years, and to this day I remember him as the keenest judge of human character I ever met. I refer to Elder Homer Strickland, known as Old Strickland, a man that I never one time in my life ever saw open a Bible in a pulpit, because he could quote entire chapters of it from memory, because he had spent lots of time studying and meditating on the Bible. Somebody said he must have had a photographic memory. That's just a lame excuse a lot of people use. There's a lot of folks, if God had given you a photographic memory, would be too lazy to take any pictures. I want you to think about that. There's many, many places that my wife and I have traveled, and we've had a camera in the car. And then after we'd leave, my wife said, I wish I'd got a picture of this or that or those folks. And now that the little grandchildren come along, and they're along quite often, there's things they do. My wife said, I wish I'd have gotten the camera. But it takes a little effort to get the camera out. Sometimes you've got to drop what you're doing. It takes a little effort to get the camera out, take the picture, and then have the picture developed. So the old excuse that I don't know the Bible like other people know the Bible because so-and-so has a photographic memory is just a lame excuse. A lot of folks, if God had given them the camera, they'd be too lazy to take any pictures. And then after they took the pictures, they'd be too lazy to go back and look at them again. But the man I'm referring to spent many years diligently studying and meditating on the Bible, was a keen judge of human character. He could meet people and just be with them a few minutes and size them up accurately, and I never knew him to be wrong. And some of the people that he sized up very quickly took me a little while to find them out. But I remember most of everything he ever told me, and I've been thinking this morning about some things he told me when I was a teenage boy. And he said, Sonny, as you go through life, said, you're going to learn a lot through reading, and said you'll learn a lot through listening, But he said some of the greatest lessons I've ever learned in life are through observation. He said, observe people, observe nature, observe things. Learn to be a keen observer. And I've noticed that that's an area in which more people are deficient in this particular day than any day I know. It's been proven by doctors and lawyers and people who study the American people that the American people living today, including college graduates, are the poorest listeners that have ever been in the United States. If you have any doubt of that, just consult a school teacher. The generation of people living today are the poorest listeners that have ever lived in this nation according to surveys and tests. The people that are living today, including many of our young preachers, are the poorest observers that I've ever read about in any time in history. But I want to talk to you this morning about what the Bible says about the importance of observing, the importance of observation. I turned to the wisest man that ever walked this planet, other than the God-man, the Lord Jesus Christ. But as far as ordinary humans, the wisest man that ever lived was Solomon. And so I've had people ask me over about a 40-year span, says, well, Brother Powell, you know, the Bible says toward the end of time that people will become weaker and wiser. The Bible does not say that. That is not in the Bible. The Bible does not say toward the end of time people will become weaker and wiser, and thinking people would not make a statement like that. Because the wisest man that will ever live on this earth has already been here, Solomon. Because Solomon was told by Almighty God that God had blessed him with so much wisdom that there would be none like him before him or after him. So that settles the idea that people will become weaker and wiser. The wisest man's done been here. As far as the strongest man that will ever live on earth's done been here. His name was Samson. The wisest man that ever lived here has already been here. The Bible does not say people will become weaker and wiser. People living today are probably the most ignorant people have ever been. And a statement that I would just as soon as you took a piece of 60D sandpaper and rubbed it across the tip of my big nose, I'd soon you did that as to make this statement to me that children living today are smarter than people used to be. That is not true. That is not true. 70 years ago in the United States of America, when a young man became grown or a young lady became grown, the system we had back then had produced a young man that could build his own house from the ground up. He could grow his own garden. He knew how to tend to animals. He could tend to animals. He could cure his own meat. He could doctor his animals. He knew how to take care of his animals. They could produce their own eggs, their own meat. They could cure it. That man could go out in the woods, cut the timber, build his own house from the ground up. The lady there at the house, the little young lady there at the house, knew how to tend to the garden, knew how to can the food, knew how to make clothes for herself and her family. They knew how to make a lot of their own medicines. They were a self-sufficient people. The modern American educational system is not producing smarter people. It is producing a generation of specialists. They know how to do one thing. They're highly trained in giving lectures on the mating habits of the fruit fly, or they know how to punch buttons on a computer. But don't ask them where they left their car keys. That is very true. I do not appreciate the attitude many people have that young people living today are smarter than people used to be. I could tell you about a lot of things that my little grandchildren are doing that's very advanced and it's super smart. The only reason is they're exposed to more. Back 40 years ago, when my sister was coming up out in the country, my sister was exposed to TVs, VCRs, and all that type of thing. Had she been exposed to them, she would be producing some of the same little cuties my grandchildren are producing. They're not exposed to them. Now then, I told you the other night that when I was a youngster, I memorized the multiplication table way up yonder. I still have it memorized today. My children cannot do that unless you give them a calculator. My wife and I both have a better handwriting than any of our children because we were forced to do drills and such as this. Many, many times people tell me, say, Brother Powell, you come and preach for us next year, put us on your calendar. I don't keep a calendar, got it right here. You want to take me outside, I'll tell you where I'm supposed to be for the entire next year, and I'll tell you the day I'm supposed to get there and the day I'm supposed to leave. I'll do that for you for a year and never look at a note. You want to try me? I'm not going to just say the 5th Sunday in January. I'll tell you when I get there and I'll tell you when I leave. I keep it here. Try that on some of this younger generation of preachers that's supposed to be smarter than folks used to be. Try it on them. Just try it. I'm not being sarcastic. I'm not being ugly. I'm not intentionally being ugly. I'm trying to assure you of something this morning, that God gave us some tools to work with. He gave you some tools to work with. But a lot of folks today are going through life with crutches. They're using their little crutches. And a lot of these wonderful devices that we're using today are nothing but just crutches. You keep on using that crutch. You keep on using that ed machine. You keep on using that calculator. Eventually you won't be able to figure in your head. And you keep on paying no attention to what people are saying, well, I'll read that for myself. And after a while you lose your ability to remember what you're reading and what you're dealing with. God gave a law, and that law is if you don't use it, you're going to lose it. If you don't use it, you're going to lose it. Now then, in talking to you about the importance of nature and observation and studying, I want to go to the wisest man that ever lived on this earth, Solomon. We go back to the book of Proverbs, and we find where Solomon told about a great lesson that he had learned just by observation. He learned it just by watching. He had not learned this lesson by reading books. He had not learned this lesson by going to school and hearing somebody deliver a lecture. Solomon had learned this lesson just by studying life. We come to the 24th chapter of Proverbs, verse 30, and Solomon says, I passed by the field of the slothful, and I went by the vineyard of the man void of understanding. Solomon says, I went by the lazy man's farm. That's what the word slothful means, a lazy person. I went by the field of the slothful, and I went by the vineyard of the man void of understanding. And he said, I considered it. And right here, I want to learn a great lesson. It's generally said in this world today that if you want to learn something, get around good examples. I mean, just study good examples. Just study people that do things right. Get around the good examples. Solomon is telling us that you can learn lessons from bad examples. He's going to learn a great lesson here from a man that did it all wrong. And I've said to people lots of times, if you think you're worthless in this life and don't serve any purpose, at least you can serve as a bad example. You can at least show me how not to do it. Nobody is totally worthless. We have words being slung around today, and I don't appreciate them, but there's certain people out here in society are said to be non-contributing people. They're said to be non-productive people. Well, when I see some of these street people and folks out here that are supposed to be non-contributing people, they won't work, and they out here walking the streets and doing things like that and sleeping under the bridges, they're said to be non-contributing, non-productive people. But they contribute something to me. They teach me to don't live that way. They teach me to be diligent about what I do. They teach me to try to tend to my business, and else I'll probably wind up where they are. They contribute something to me. Solomon says, I passed by the field of the slothful and the vineyard of the man void of understanding, and he says, I considered it. You know what that means? That means he said, I stood there and I studied it. I studied it. Here's the wisest man that ever walked this planet, took up enough of his valuable time to study a rundown farm. He said, I considered it well and I received instruction. Well, Brother Solomon, what in the world did that teach you? He said, that taught me that a little sleep, a little folding of the hands, and he says, so shall your poverty come like one that traveled. It'll just come traveling. And he said, it'll come on you like an armed man that'll rob you of everything you've got. Solomon learned a great lesson by observation. He stood there and studied that. He said that condition was brought on by how much sleep? It was brought on by a little sleep. Just a little folding of the hands. I've told folks across this country, especially I've tried to preach to young people when I've delivered baccalaureate sermons and young people in my home church, that trying to get 15 minutes extra sleep can cause you to miss an important class in college. Trying to get 15 extra minutes sleep can throw an entire day out of kilter. You've got to rush somewhere. Maybe you're going to miss a plane. Maybe you're going to ruin an entire day, not only for you, but for somebody else over a little sleep. Maybe just a little sleep. There's a person down here waiting on you for a job interview. And maybe that man waiting on you down there for a job interview could open up a door for a career that would change your entire life. And I could talk to you about a man right now. My wife's dad lived past 99 years of age, and he was very successful with National Biscuit Company, Nabisco. And he was outstanding in sales and in training salesmen. And there was a young man once upon a time who now has a high-ranking job, not with Nabisco, but he's got a high-ranking job and travels over different parts of the country, and for a while was the mayor of Hope, Arkansas, where our president came from. My mother-in-law told me a few days ago that once upon a time this young man had a peanut dead-end job, just sort of as an order picker working in the mailroom, and my father-in-law, who was one of their top salesmen and visiting with him, saw potentiality in him, and my father-in-law, who had a pull with the boss man, Mr. Jernigan, went to Mr. Jernigan and told him, said, you've got a salesman down there in the order room. That man has got what it takes to be a salesman, because after all, salesmen are born, not made. I believe that. Oh, you can train, or you can bring out the potentiality. You can bring out the potentiality. Or there's training you got to have. But there's certain instincts, there's certain things that are put into you, but they've got to be developed. And my father-in-law told the boss man, he said, oh, why don't you take him out with you and test him out? He took that young man out with him, got him out of a dead-end job where he had never gone anywhere, and that young man went to the top, went with other companies, and he's a very successful man today. His whole life was turned around by one statement that my father-in-law made and opened the door for him. So maybe you're headed toward a place like that. Maybe there's a man waiting on you at 8:30 that could open a door that would change your entire life. But maybe that man's a Vince Lombardi. Maybe to him, on time is 15 minutes early. And you get there 15 minutes late. You've done left a sour taste in his mouth. Solomon says all it takes to wind up in poverty. He says the difference between success and poverty is just a little sleep, a little folding of the hands. That's all it takes. Just a little bit of laziness at the right moment. That's all, or the wrong moment. Just a little bit here, just a little bit there. And I say to you this morning with all the conviction of my heart that I've also learned that by observing myself and by observing other people. I also find where Solomon teaches us another great lesson. Solomon says lots of times poverty comes simply because all it takes just a little sleep at the wrong time, just a little laziness at the wrong time, and he says that produces poverty. Finally, I come over to the 6th chapter of Proverbs. And Solomon tells every lazy person on earth to go study something. He doesn't tell lazy people, you need to get over here and take a college course on productivity. You don't need to go to a seminar on business management. He doesn't say you need to go down here and study a bunch of books on how to be successful in business. You know where he tells a sluggard to go? Proverbs chapter 6, verse 6. He tells that sluggard, he says, go to the ant, thou sluggard. And my friends, the lazy people we have in this country living on welfare and all that type of thing need to go out here and study an anthill. And I say to you this about my nation this morning, and I've said it many times. A squash bush, or a squash vine if you prefer, can support so many bugs and still bear squash. But after a while, you can get enough bugs on it that it'll kill that vine. And our nation is such a productive, strong nation that we've been able to support some bugs all along. But we're getting more and more bugs on the old bush. When the Social Security system was set up years ago, there were about 35 people or more paying into it for everybody that was riding the boat for free. Finally, it reached the point there's only about 5 people chipping in out here for those that were riding the boat. Now it's down to about 2 or 3. And I'm not throwing rocks at Social Security. I suppose if the world goes on, I'll someday be standing there wanting my share of it. But there's one thing you can bear in mind. The money you're drawing out of it today is not what you put in. The average person today that's drawing it, it doesn't take but about 3 or 4 years to get out every dollar you put into it. Because the limit you could put into it in a year up to 1971 was less than $400. That was a year. There are a lot of folks drawing it today that didn't put in over $30 or $40 a year, and they're drawing several hundred a month from it. So don't tell me you're drawing your own money back. You're not doing it. When folks folks that are drawing it today are dependent on people like me and you and my son David to pay in to keep them going. And one of these days, I'm living in hope that if I ever have to start drawing, that David and my son-in-law and some of you young folks out here will fork in enough to keep me going. That's what's keeping the boat going. Not just throwing rocks at that. I could name a lot of other things today. I said, I believe down Parkview a few weeks back. I was watching a TV show one night, and the man running the show asked the audience out there, said, how many people out here feel like you are entitled to free food, that is from the government? You're entitled to free medical care. You're entitled to this, entitled to that. And he named all a bunch of things. How many think you're entitled to that? A bunch of people shut their hands up. These things nowadays are called entitlements, by the way. They've got fancy names for things. Things that we used to call taxes are now called your contribution. I mailed in my contribution yesterday. We are told now that we need to turn our pockets wrong side out and make an investment in the Soviet Union. Mr. Henry Kissinger said one time, he said, the average American has got a political memory of 3 weeks. I think he's very generous. Once upon a time, back in the late 1930s, early 1940s, we made an investment in Japan. Back in the late 30s, I believe early 40s, late 30s, we made an investment in Japan. We sent them tons and tons of scrap metal. That was our great investment in Japan. They sent it back to us in the form of Japanese Zero airplanes, bombs, and shrapnel. Make your investment in the Soviet Union. I promise you it'll come back to you. Give it a little time, it'll all work out. There's an old saying, the only lesson people have ever learned from history is that man never learns anything from history. Amen. I'll amen that one myself. So now we're told that folks out here are entitled to free food. My question is, who pays for the food? Somebody's got to pay for it. They're entitled to free medical care. You can get out here and take drugs all your life and abuse your body and destroy it with drugs, and you're entitled to free medical care. You can get out here and violate God's law, and you come down with AIDS or something like that, and you're entitled to free medical care. Well, fine. I keep asking the question, who's supposed to pay for it? Now then, watch this. Solomon has this to say about sluggards. He said, go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. I've got to stop right there. I realize I'm about to infuriate all the women's livers. Solomon didn't say, go to the ant, thou sluggard, and consider its ways, or his ways. He said her ways. And when you go to school a little bit, you don't have to go to school. Just go home and get your encyclopedia. You start studying ants. You say, oh, I know, I'm not interested in studying ants. The wisest man that ever lived said you need to study ants. Smartest man that ever lived said study ants. You say, well, I haven't got time to go home and pull out the encyclopedia and start reading up on ants, but I'd pay you to do it. When you start studying the ant society, you're going to find that they've got their kings, you know, their rulers, and their drones, and their soldiers, and all that. They've got a civilization too. But they're down in the anthill. Those up on the top hunting the food and doing all the work are the females. Don't send this film to Hillary. I mean, I've got enough enemies as it is. But he says, go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. Says the ant's wise. You know why they're wise? They're wise because they prepare ahead of time. He says, go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. And he says, which having no guide, overseer, or ruler. That says without a guide, an overseer, or ruler, they get out here and do what they're supposed to anyway. Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise, which having no guide, overseer, or ruler, says provideth her meat provideth her meat in the summer, and gathereth her food in the harvest. You know, he's just told us there that ant with a brain so small, you could probably put it on the end of a pen, and you'd probably have to look at it with a microscope. That God gave that ant enough sense to recognize that it won't always be summer. That these seeds won't always be out here on top of the ground. That one of these days my anthill will be covered over with ice. and the ground would be buried with snow. And now is my opportunity. I've got to get busy in the day of opportunity. It says, gathereth her food in the harvest and produces her meat in the summer. You'll find all through the Bible that summer is used in the Bible as a picture of opportunity. You're also going to find in the Bible winter is used as a picture of hindrance, just time and time again. Summer is the time of opportunity. Now, sometimes summer is used in the literal sense. It means summer. But sometimes it pictures the time of opportunity. You remember Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 20? Here was a nation that was living in wickedness. And God had sent prophets to them. He had sent the weeping prophet Jeremiah to warn them, and they wouldn't hear him and listen to the prophet. He says, lo, the harvest is past, the summer is ended, and yet we're not saved. And that didn't have one reference to hell or heaven. It had reference to the judgments of God right here on this earth. And when he said the harvest is past and the summer is ended, that means our day of opportunity is over. I find in the scriptures he says that this ant is wise. Why? Because said she gets out here in the day of opportunity and she provides for the day when she'll have no opportunity. My friends, that's teaching people that while you're young and while you have strength to prepare for a day when you won't have it. That teaches us that. But I read some very chilling facts. I read from financial journals that over 70% of the money and savings in America is owned by people 55 or over. You know what that's teaching me? That teaching me most young people in this country living like there's no tomorrow. There will be a tomorrow. You say, well, who'll take care of you in the tomorrow? This gentleman here knows that a lot of them, when you ask them that question, say, well, the government will. You know, I'll take care of it. Welfare will take care of me. I'm not making this up. I'm not imagining this. Some of you gentlemen out here teach school, put that to your students. I mean, try them on it. I've tried young people on it. What's going to happen one of these days if you don't get a sufficient education, if you don't learn a skill, if you don't learn to do without? What's going to happen one of these days out here? Who's going to take care of you then? The answer is the government will. Welfare will. That's not what Solomon's teaching here. Solomon says that you can learn lessons by studying the ants. He says the ant teaches us, he says, go to the ant, thou sluggard, and consider her ways and be wise. And then he tells us the same example after telling you to observe the anthill. Same example. He says, a little sleep. Same old example. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands. And said, poverty will come upon you. The American people today have made a god out of sleep. You say, well, people need lots of sleep. I can show you some medical research where a lot of people are getting too much. They've made a god out of sleep. The Bible doesn't have too many good things to say about sleep. And I've got to get off of sleepers because I get especially riled up preaching about sleepers. Because I've had some people in my family most of my life that the way I know when to go to bed, when to get up is when they go to bed. Now, when they go to bed, it's time for me to get up. So I'm gonna get off of this, you know, lest I get especially riled up. As an old farmer one time, had a great big farm. He had some bunk houses, and he hired a bunch of college boys to help him during the summer. And he goes down there about 4 a.m. with his light and knocks on the door, and they're inside playing cards and drinking beer. And he says, boys, it's 4 a.m. You better go to bed, old man. We got a lot of work to do tomorrow. Well, I've been around some not quite that bad, but just about that bad. So we have some lessons here that you learn by observation. I want to talk to you about something else that you can learn just by observation. I remember for many years in the wheat country in West Texas, many years there was a saying among the farmers that anytime you have a lot of barberry weeds in the fence rows, you're going to have a smut or fungus on the wheat. Well, the agricultural boys down at A&M, all the ag boys and all the educated people laughed at that. Those that had studied agronomy and agricultural economics, hardy, that's just an old superstition. No connection whatsoever between barberry weeds and that smut or fungus that gets on the wheat. No connection whatever. No scientific connection. Well, those farmers couldn't prove that there's any scientific connection, But they had lived long enough, and they'd done enough observing, and they'd done enough remembering, that during the years that there was a lot of barberry weeds, they just had enough God-given sense to remember that at the same time they had that sputter fungus on the wheat. And they could have no more explained to you the connection, and so the scientific farmers and the ag boys just laughed it to scorn. But the farmers had enough common sense that they'd seen it. When you see one, you see the other. When my son, I believe, was a freshman at Texas Tech, he came in and told me, he said, turned out the farmer's been right all along. They had discovered that this smut, the fungus, causes that, that sputter fungus, the organism that causes that, has got a cycle. In other words, it lives a while on the wheat. And then it goes back over here and lives somewhere else, stays dormant for a few years, you see. And when it goes through its cycle, it's got to live a little while on a barberry weed. You've got to have a barberry weed to live. And then keeps its cycle going. And I could get a little gross about this. I could talk to you about heel flies and cattle grubs and a lot of other things. But there's a lot of things out here in nature got a cycle. Corn borers, corn worms got a cycle. And you say, well, we'll take care of that with pesticides and insecticides. God had another way of taking care of it. God told the children of Israel to let the land rest 1 year out of 7. He said, don't work that land 1 year out of 7. 1 year out of 7, it stays still. All right, what's this? You've got corn borer, corn worm. That thing has got to live part of that cycle in corn. It cannot make it unless it lives part of, it's got a cycle. Lives part of it in corn, goes back in the ground, but it's got to live in corn to complete that cycle. Same thing with a cotton, with a boll weevil. All those things, they've got to live a little while in the host plant. Now let's suppose you had a year where there's no corn in the land. Fields are all idle. What are you going to do to a lot of those pests? They're going to die because you done broke the cycle. I could go with the same thing with about cotton, wheat. I don't know enough about tobacco. Tobacco worms talk about that. I won't get into that, but I do know about a lot of other things. That there are a lot of these pests out here. Well, I would take up the cattle grub. That gets a little gross, but they got cycles. Okay, you have a year where there's no corn, there's no cotton, all the fields are idle. You done broke the cycle. You done set the bugs back. That was God's way. No pesticides, no insecticides, no poisons. And so that got rid of a lot of problems that we're drowning under today. God's way, ever so simple. So finally, the scientists down at Texas A&M, the ag boys out of Texas Tech, they found out the farmers were right. There is a connection. The farmer couldn't have explained that scientifically, but you know, there's one thing, he could see it. He could see it, even though he couldn't explain it. Now then, I remember back when my wife was carrying David, our first child, there was a big fad among the young mothers back then that the most prominent man in the field of child care and how to bring your children up was a fellow named Dr. Benjamin Spock. And it was just understood among my wife and all of her friends back then that everybody's got to read Dr. Spock's book. It's the bestseller, it's the hottest item, everybody better read Dr. Spock. Well, Dr. Spock was advocating some ideas in there against corporal punishment. That's English translation of whip, that means whipping them. You know, reason with them, child psychology. If they set the house afire, you don't whip them, you call them over and say, we need to talk. They need to express themselves and all that. And my wife's friends were just swallowing it hook, line, and sinker and, you know, figuring out ways to incorporate it. And I distinctly remember my wife reading that one day, and she said, this won't work, this is rotten, because it's contrary to the Bible. Well, here's a man with all his scientific research and all that, and all his theories and everything, saying one thing, but my wife's common sense told her another. Dr. Spock lived long enough to see a generation of children come up on his theories. And I've got the clippings at home for anybody who wants to see them. He later repudiated his own theories and said they don't work. They don't work. Well, I knew they wouldn't work. And you know why? Because I used to be a young'un myself. Wouldn't have worked on me. Wouldn't have worked on me. Next thing I knew, they wouldn't work. You know why? Because I'd read in the Bible in Proverbs chapter 22, verse 15, that foolishness is bound in the heart of a child. Yes, it is. It's in there by nature. You do not have to teach children to lie. You don't have to teach them to lie. You don't have to teach children to come in and say, I saw 5 red bears in the backyard. You don't have to teach them to come in and make up golly whoppers. You don't have to teach them that. It's in there. You have to teach them the importance of telling the truth. You do not have to teach your children to eat like hogs. If you think they've got to be taught that, I go home and sneak a few photographs of my grandkids. You don't have to teach them to eat like hogs. You have to teach them table manners. You don't have to teach them to be rude and sassy. You have to teach them respect. He says foolishness is bound in the heart of a child. He said the rod of correction will drive it far from him. That's what Solomon says. Yet we have our nation today flying against it. Your good sense tells you it's not so. You know why? Because of what you've observed. I have observed in my lifetime some youngsters raised up on that type of thing. I've watched youngsters raised up on it, and I have seen where it has led them. When you start talking about observing things that take place out here in this world, the Lord Jesus Christ rebuked his disciples in the 16th chapter of Matthew, rebuked the Jews. His Jewish critics came to him in Matthew chapter 16, and they said to him, Lord, show us a sign. We want to see a sign. Well, that fits, because 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 22 says the Jews require a sign. The Lord's going to rebuke them several ways. One way he rebukes them is, a wicked, a evil, and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign, and says, there shall be no sign given unto it but the sign of the prophet Jonas. The sign the Lord gave them, they didn't pay any attention to. He said, I'm going to give you one great sign, that I'm the Messiah, that I'm the Savior, and he said, that'll be the sign of the prophet Jonas. Well, when they studied, when they saw the sign of the prophet Jonas, they denied it. They didn't pay attention to it. And the Lord told them in advance they wouldn't pay any attention to it. When they came to him seeking a sign, he told them, said, an evil and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign. There will be no sign given unto but the sign of the prophet Jonas. And he told them, he says, you look out here at the weather. And he said, when it's evening and the sun's going down, the sky's red, you say it'll be fair weather. Now, from what I've studied about the weather of that part of the world, this is true. Of course, I knew it was true, but I don't mean exactly like that. But maybe you might say, well, in our country, we could have a red sky and it'd be bad weather tomorrow. Not next to the Mediterranean Ocean. Not in that country. The Lord tells them, he told them something that they knew. They'd seen it day after day. He said, you go out in the evening and said you observe. That's what I'm trying to talk about this morning, is observation. He said, you go out in the evening, said you observe the weather. And people do observe the weather. I suppose most everybody in this congregation watches or listens to it in the evening, or you do it in the morning several times during the day, or read about it in the paper. There's probably, I doubt there's not too many people in this congregation sometime this week, maybe this very day, haven't spent some time observing the weather. But the Lord is about to rebuke us. He said we're more diligent in observing the weather than we are observing the signs of the times. And I'm afraid most of us have to say guilty is charged. We'd have to plead guilty of that one. I know a lot of folk. First thing in the morning, listen to that weather forecast. All during the day, listen to the weather forecast. Listen to it at noon. Listen to it in the evening. They want to read it in the paper. If it's a bad one, they'll listen to 3 or 4 of them, hoping somebody will make it a little better. Why don't we add up sometime the amount of time we spend studying the weather and talking about the weather compared to the time that we spend studying God's Word and talking about God's Word? Why don't you total that up next week? That'd be a real good project for everybody. I mean, just carry a little pad with you, and all the time you spend listening to the weatherman, jot that down, and the time you spend reading the weatherman, listening to the weatherman on the radio, and watching him on TV, and talking to people about the weather, add that up. And at the end of the week, here's the score. Now, at the same time, add up the time you spend diligently meditating and studying the Word of God. The Lord told him, he said, you study that weather. He said, you observe it. He said, when in the evening and said the sun's going down, the sky's red, you say it'll be fair weather tomorrow. But he said, when you get up in the morning, he said if the sky is red and lowering, that means, black clouds coming down heavier and heavier. He said, you say it will be foul weather today. He says, you hypocrites, said you study the signs of the sky. But said you don't study the signs of the times. Now, I wouldn't have to go too far to find lots of people can tell me more about the signs of the sky, the weather conditions, than they are about the signs of the times we're living in. He told them, said, I'm going to give you something to observe. He said, no sign will be given unto you except the sign of the prophet Jonas. You say, what's that one? Well, he gave it to them. They didn't observe it. Matthew chapter 12, verses 39 and 40. He says, and as Jonas was in the whale's belly 3 days and 3 nights, so shall the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth 3 days and 3 nights. That's the sign of the prophet Jonas. And there came a time that he was buried in a grave. He was in that grave 3 days and 3 nights, and he arose from the dead, and he walked among them. He walked among his disciples over 40 days and nights. He was seen by many public witnesses after he arose from the dead, and they didn't pay any attention to the sign of the prophet Jonas and went ahead and denied him and said that his resurrection was a lie, that it was a farce, that his disciples came and stole the body. They didn't observe the one sign they gave him, that he did give them, the sign of the prophet Jonas. And I don't intend to get into this morning, but I'd be glad to get into it at any time. I've had people ask me for many, many years, how could Jesus be crucified on Good Friday, rise from the dead Easter Sunday morning, be in the grave 3 days and 3 nights? The answer to that is very simple. He was not crucified on Good Friday morning, and he did not rise from the dead on Easter Sunday morning. Truth of the matter is, he was crucified on Wednesday evening. The Jewish day begins and ends at sundown. Ours changes midnight, theirs changes sundown. He was in that tomb 3 days and 3 nights and arose from the dead in what you would call the dark part of Saturday night. Because when those women head to that tomb on what you would call Sunday morning, dark part of Sunday morning, all 4 gospel writers take up the time to tell you that the sun, the Sunday sun as people call it, hadn't come up yet. They say, while it was yet dark, while it was yet dark, while it was yet dark. There's no Easter sunrise service here. Because it's all taken place. They go out there in the dark and it's all over. They done missed it. It's all over. Here's the evidence. It's all over. No Easter sunrise service here. If you want to study something about sunrises, go to the Bible and read about Baal, the sun worshiper. And then go to the World Book Encyclopedia and start, or if you don't have a Britannica, see, I'm telling you, you don't have to go down here and get a college level encyclopedia, just get the one your kids use. A lot of people come to me sometimes and say, where'd you find all that? Where'd you find all that out? You know, like it's top secret information? And I show them it's right there on their bookshelves. Why, if you want to know where these sunrises services came from, all those old Baalites that worship the sun god Baal, I mean, they were out there early in the morning, hoping to see their God come up. I like to see the sun come up too, but I don't worship the sun, I worship the God that made it, because David took a shot at all these sun worshipers in the 19th Psalm, verse 1, when he says, the heavens declare the glory of God. We're not to worship the moon, the stars, the planets, we're to worship the God who made them and give him glory. Well, the Lord rebuked those people back then because they didn't observe what was going on. He said, you won't study the signs of the times. Now then, when we began to try to study the world in which we're living, people say, well, I don't what you fix to say discourages me. Well, it shouldn't. It shouldn't. Because the Lord told you in the 21st chapter of Luke, verses 26 and 27, that when all these things begin to come to pass, lift up your heads. Rejoice. Why? Because your redemption draweth nigh. It shouldn't cause it. Now then, I read practically every day I live, I read of some new discovery, either in newspapers, medical journals, various stuff people send me. There's folks all over this country that I know a little bit about this, that, or the other, and so there's people who know a whole lot about it, and I get clippings and photocopies from folks, and I appreciate it. I'll have to borrow brains. But there's a lot of folks over here in different fields that listen to my tapes, so they met me somewhere, and they're all the time sending me information I couldn't get otherwise, and I'm thankful, and I at least do read it. But there's hardly a day passes in my life that I don't hear of some great discovery that medical science has made about the relationship between the mind and the body. Just like they're exploding brand new fields. And most people have got the wrong definition of a psychosomatic illness. That does not mean it's imaginary or all in your head. That doesn't mean that. Doesn't mean that at all. Psychosomatic does not mean it's all in your head or you just imagine it. That word psyche means mind, and soma is body. And what that is saying is there is a relationship between the mind and the body. And it's far, far greater than the medical world's ever suspected. I mean, they just scratching the surface of it. They haven't come near figuring it out yet. Years ago, I used to meet people that tell me, they say, my arthritis, my rheumatism, gout, all this, hurts me a lot worse if I get upset, if I get depressed. A few years ago, you go down to your medical doctor, tell him that, and you go, hardy, har, it's all in your head. Well, it's not all in your head. I want to quote you a scripture. I want to quote you a man that was, he lived about 1,000 years before Christ, and it's, they tell me 1993. I want to quote you a man that was 3,000 years ahead of medical science. I go to Proverbs chapter 17, verse 22, and Solomon says, a merry heart doeth good like a medicine. A merry heart doeth good like a medicine. That's just saying that when people are thankful and rejoicing and counting their blessings, that merry heart will do good like a medicine. Well, medical science has come along and they've tried to, and they've dug, and what they've come up with now is that when I'm out here rejoicing and I've got my mind right and got my spirits lifted up, that my brain actually causes my body to produce the feel-good hormones. And it has a chemical effect on your brain. When you're out here in a good mood, you're not worrying, you're not fretting, you got your mind on good things and all this. It's not just in your head. The brain's down there working on the glands, and they're producing these feel-good hormones. It's actually producing chemicals to your body to make you better. And they've got big names for them, dopamine and serotonin. They've got names for them, naturally expected that. Now, on the other hand, when a person gets upset, you're going to find arteries and blood capillaries start tightening up. And then you're going to find many times there's a little gadget down here that starts causing the stomach to produce too much hydrochloric acid and all that. You know what you're doing? You're poisoning your own body. The brain down here causes things to kick in, produces things destructive to you. Now watch this. The medical world's all excited about this. Bill Moyers had a big special on public TV a while back. Ran about 2 or 3 nights, healing in the mind, like great new discoveries. That was in God's Bible 3,000 years ago. A merry heart doeth good like a medicine, but now watch this, but a broken spirit drieth the bones. That's why your arthritis, rheumatism, gout, whatever, that's why it'll bother you more when you get upset. The Bible says a broken spirit drives the bones out. That's very simple, isn't it? Now then, let's do some observing. We come to the 25th chapter of Matthew, verse 25. And the Lord Jesus Christ says there would come a time when there would come on earth distress of nations. This is not just one nation. This is not just the Jews in the destruction of Jerusalem. This is worldwide distress. And everywhere you turn today, you see distress. You say, well, we're over here suffering and the Japs are getting rich. You're behind the times. Japanese having all kinds of health problems. They're out here dumping garbage on their beaches and all over their nation, worse than they are in America. Japanese over here having economic problems because the Koreans are doing to the Japs what the Japs did to us. They say, well, the Koreans are going to have it made. No, the people down in the Philippines are making those athletic shoes that you give $75 for. They found that they used to sew them up in Japan real cheap and then send them back over here and sell them to you cheaper than your labor union people could sew them together. Then they found they could get them sewed for $1.05 a day in Korea. Well, now they found out they can get them sewed up for a few cents a day in the Philippines. So the Koreans did to the Japs what the Japs did to us, and now the Filipinos are doing to the Koreans. You see what we're saying? Why, just distress everywhere. Russia's broke. Europe is broke. Distress everywhere you turn. He said they come on earth, distress of nations with perplexity. I hope you remember me telling you before that word perplexity means surrounded on all sides and can't see any way out. That's what it means. And nobody around seems to have any solutions. You say, well, everywhere I look, surrounded, there's problems. I don't see any way out. Yeah, there is a way out. Lord said, look up. That's the way out. And he said there would come a time on earth when men's hearts would be failing them for fear. The greatest doctor that ever lived gave you the chief cause of heart failure. Said men's hearts would be failing them for fear. Somebody says, oh no, it's cholesterol. Fine. You've got to have cholesterol. Your liver manufactures it. In fact, 80% of your cholesterol comes out of is made to your own liver. Only 20% comes out of your diet. You go to your medical doctor, he says, I didn't know that. You tell him he better get updated. You say, well, I went to my medical doctor and he contradicted you. That's fine. That's probably not the first time he's been wrong. I happen to know what I'm talking about here. I had to correct a medical doctor just a few days ago who had told somebody that your own body can manufacture vitamin C. It cannot. Your dog can make it. You can't. Back when that doctor and other doctors went to medical school, they studied a surrogate vitamin C. That when you don't have it coming in, your body makes a surrogate. It's called lipoprotein A. But they found out lately that it's actually harmful. It's a great factor. You go to your doctor sometime, he measures out your cholesterol, he says you got too few HDLs and too many LDLs. That's high density, low density lipoproteins. Those low density lipoproteins are mostly influenced by surrogate vitamin C that your body's manufacturing because you're not taking in enough. You say, well, I'm going to go talk to my doctor, and when I talk to him, he didn't know anything about that. Well, you tell him I just educated him for free. Now then, watch this. Here's a human being that you have manufactured the right amount of cholesterol all your life. Now all of a sudden you're making too much. What I want to know is why. I want to know why. You say eating too many eggs. I'll give you medical research of people that have eaten 25 a day and didn't build up cholesterol. One old character, Baffa. I'm not trying, if your doctor says don't eat them, don't eat them. I'm not trying to go against him, but I'm just telling you they're on the wrong track. Yeah, they're on the wrong track. A great deal of it is this factor right up here. Right here. That's right. Yeah, you know. It's right up here. And there's things get started up here that foul the liver up, and then the liver starts making too much of it. Starts right up here. So your doctor starts taking your eggs away, and he's dealing with the end of it. It's like folks go out here and they say, you know, everywhere I see flies, I see garbage. Therefore, flies make garbage. That's about how smart a lot of people are today. Flies cause garbage because everywhere you find garbage, you're going to find flies, right? Like an old farmer in Kentucky one time, he was so proud of his rooster, and he told his friends that that rooster crows so loud he makes the sun come up every morning. But the best case I ever heard of, and this is a true one, by the way, actual one, there's some Yankees from up north one time went out across West Texas where they irrigate out there just flat as it could be, and they have irrigation wells all over, and back then they had windmills all, well, we still do, have windmills all over the place, and the windmills, you know, pump the water out of the ground, etc., etc. Big windmills, you've seen them, big windmills just everywhere. And as a lady up north came out there one day and stopped at a gas station out around Muleshoe, Texas, And she stood out there in that powerful wind they have in the Panhandle, and she said, "Gee, those little fans sure stir up a big breeze, don't they?" Well, that's about how smart a lot of medical people are in trying to figure something out. The little fans are making the big wind. I want to go to the greatest heart doctor that ever lived on this earth. Jesus Christ says there come a time when the hearts of men will be failing them for fear. You know why? They're afraid of something. You know what they're afraid of? They're afraid of the future. He says the hearts of men be failing them for fear for looking after those things that are coming on the earth. They do not have the confidence in the future that folks used to have. When my wife and I got married about 36 years ago, I didn't have any money, didn't even really have a good job, and didn't bother us. We started out in life with nothing, still got most of it through good management, didn't bother us. I wasn't scared of the future. I mean, I had her, and that's all I wanted. I was very confident, felt like God would bless us. One day we'd have a family, maybe pay for our own furniture and all that, and I was looking forward to living. People don't have that confidence in the future. Just 30-some-odd short years later, they don't have that confidence in the future. You know why? Because even the younger people I talk to today feel insecure about their jobs. They're insecure about the school system. They're selling houses here and buying one over there. I know them by the hundreds that are doing it. Selling a house, going to move over here. They're scared of the school system over here. Maybe it'd be better over there. We're living in a nation that's drowning in fear. But the main thing most people are afraid of is tomorrow. I want to drop you one other thing. I want to talk to you this morning about that observation teaches us. Sometimes people, when they first get exposed to what we believe about our salvation, they'll make the statement, they'll say, "Well, I wouldn't preach that kind of doctrine, that you're saved by grace, you don't do anything to get it, and you can't do anything to lose it, it's all in God's hands. I wouldn't preach that because that encourages people to be wicked." Well, I want to talk to you about what observation teaches some people. I had a great uncle, pastored one church 57 years, preached 61 years, and at the time my great uncle died, the church he was serving was probably the largest church in Arkansas or Oklahoma at that time. It was out in a little community. And you'd get out in that little community long ago, and you could start up that road, and there's somebody, just nearly every farmhouse, somebody on the road had baptized. You'd go that way, somebody he'd baptized, going this way, going that way. There's a young denominational preacher came in that community one time, and he couldn't get anywhere. So he started slandering my great uncle, telling people if I believe what he believed, I'd get drunk, I'd steal, I'd rob banks and stuff like that. And one time my great uncle met him, and in their conversation, he said, "Well, the only thing I've got against your doctrine," said, "it produces wickedness." My great uncle asked him, he said, "Well, you've lived here long enough to watch me." He said, "Has it produced wickedness in me? If so, I'll repent of it and apologize. Has it produced wickedness in me?" He said, "No, I'd have to say you've got a perfect reputation, and all I know about you, you're an honorable, upright man." He said, "Most of the people in this community, everywhere you go," said, "they're members of the church that I pastor." Said, "Has it produced any wickedness in them?" He said, "No," said, "they're the finest people I know." And said, "There's a saying around here," and this used to be true everywhere, that the best credit reference you could give when you went to the bank was just say, "I'm a member of the Primitive Baptist Church." That was true in that part of Arkansas, and you probably remember it being true elsewhere. And Uncle Rube said, "Well, son," said, "just looking around everywhere," said, "it doesn't seem to have produced wickedness in these people I'm preached to, and people on my church." He said, "No," said, "they got a name being the most upright people in this area." I want to talk to you about another man one time out in the world that was an observer. Back in 1970, 23 years ago, I exchanged a lot of letters with a professor of theology at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, Missouri, and he was wanting information on the Primitive Baptist, and we exchanged information for quite a while. He had studied everything he could get his hands on about Primitive Baptists, gone into libraries, he had researched books, he had devoted 2 or 3 years to this. And in a letter I have from him at home, in doing a thorough study of Primitive Baptist, I'm talking about a man who did some observing. He's observing Primitive Baptist. he said, there's one thing I've observed about Primitive Baptists that stirs up my curiosity. He says, you people teach that as far as your salvation is concerned, that that's by grace, that's in God's hands. And said, yet you have one of the strictest standards of discipline of any people I know, and you require godly living out of the members. And, he couldn't quite reconcile that in his mind. So I wrote him back and tried to explain to him how we reconcile that. That there's more than one type of salvation, and even though we feel we're saved by grace and not by works, yet we have a responsibility to live right in this world. But the point I want you to draw from that is that here's an intelligent man, a professor of theology at a seminary, that did some observing. And his conclusion was that what this church believes does not produce ungodly living. It actually produces godly living, and they require it. As I close out with this morning, some folks will make the argument that if you preach what we preach, if you preach the sovereignty and the great power of God, that it will produce wickedness. But when you go back and study the history of the world, I could go back to a time when the sovereignty of God was preached in Switzerland. I'm not talking about just by Primitive Baptists. I'm talking about these preached by other people. You go back and study Germany and Switzerland and Holland and England and continental America. And at any time in history when men were standing in the pulpit preaching the sovereign power of God, there was a moral tranquility. There was a peace and an order in those nations that's never been experienced since. It has been estimated that 3/4 of the soldiers in Washington's army, if they had a religion, believed the sovereignty of God. I didn't say they were Primitive Baptists. Because back in that day, there were other men other than Primitive Baptists proclaiming the sovereignty of God. People say, well, that doctrine produces wickedness, it produces loose living. You just go back and observe. Observe. Just observe what it produces. And my final statement is this one. I'm not the only one that's observed this. Because about 10 years ago, on a Sunday afternoon, first Sunday afternoon in March, 10 years ago, I was headed toward Perryton, Texas to start a meeting that night. And about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I was out there on the lonely plains just playing the radio, and on came Dr. Billy Graham. And as I drove along listening to him, he was talking about where our nation was headed. That's 10 years ago. And I'd have to amen what he said. He was talking about many things that were developing and what they were going to lead into and the terrible consequences of them. And all I could do is just go along and agree, because he was certainly right on that. But the statement I leave with this morning, he said, I feel that the cause of many of these things in America is that for the last 150 years, we have preached to people a weak God. He had observed that. I've also observed that. Because when a powerful, strong, sovereign God, a God of predestination, a God of election, a strong God is produced, when you respect that God, you're going to respect what he says. I respected what my daddy said because I respected him. Now, on the other hand, if I preach up to you just a little weak, sissy God that can't save you unless you let him, just a little weak God that couldn't take control of your life against your will, or wouldn't or couldn't do it, when I preach a God like that, I proclaim to you a weak God, a God that's subject to your will. Now you've lost respect for God. You know what you're going to do next? You're going to lose respect for what he said. And observation teaches you and teaches me that people every day have lost respect for what he said. I respected what my daddy said because I respected him. And I'm in homes all the time where you've got the little easy-going, mush-mouth, passive father trying to be, instead of being a father to his children, he's trying to be a buddy to them. And the children don't respect what he says. You know why they don't respect what he says? Because they don't respect him. Thank you, Brother Graham. He observed that, and I've observed it. The Lord told his disciples, you go through life, two things. Watch. Second, pray. Watch and pray. Thank you for your real good attention. We'll ask somebody to close the meeting now.
Before the throne of God above, I have a
Visit the Primitive Baptist Digital Library for videos, articles, history, hymns, and encouragement. www.primitivebaptist.net.